Welcome to the third episode of PHP Release Radar, tonight with Matt Brown from New York and about the Psalm release, I think last October. It was the first time we didn't add the minor version to the announcement because I think Psalm is already moved already on to 4.4 and I think yes. And tonight, the creator of Psalm himself is here. So, Matt, welcome to the session and thanks for joining. And maybe you can give us a quick intro who you are and how you become the creator of Psalm. Sorry, wait a second, please. I think we have a sound issue. So, let me see. So, sorry, I hope we're good now.
That's fine. Should we start? Should we start again?
Yeah, that would be awesome. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's fine.
Can we quickly check if someone in the chat can write if the sound is working now? You know, if we have a little bit of delay, so we can't really know. It works? Okay, cool.
Right.
Then, sorry.
So should I get started on like who I am?
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Probably that's the best.
All right, cool. So yeah, I'm Matt, Matt Brown. I'm here in New York City with the Empire State Building over my shoulder here, and I've been working at Vimeo in New York for about almost 7 years, and at Vimeo, I mainly have been working in PHP, and the basic origin story to Psalm, the static analysis tool I created, is that at Vimeo and just more generally in life, I tend to my brain sometimes jumps ahead of where my fingers are, as I'm writing code, and I have this I like to kind of paint in large kind of brushes, and sometimes some of the details get lost, and I would occasionally write code and commit code to the Vimeo code base and therefore to Vimeo.com that would break certain features because I wasn't really careful enough. And so rather than actually becoming disciplined in my code writing, I decided instead to write a tool that would kind of follow after me and alert me to bugs that I had created. And so I started in around mid 2015, writing a very simple tool that became more and more complicated over time. And that tool has benefited now from a large community of people also submitting their own sorts of issues that they've run into, and it's able to find lots and lots of different bugs. And at its strictest, it allows you to opt into a way of writing code that essentially prohibits you from doing anything that might be ambiguous. So writing code in a way similar to that you might write Java or C# or a kind of another strictly typed language.
All right, cool. You mentioned that you basically used it to clean up after yourself. Is that how you introduced it in your tool stack as well, where you basically just ran it locally, or did you introduce it to a pipeline?
The very first incarnation only only checked files that I touched every day. So it was limited just to a folder of files that I knew I might have made mistakes in, and I generalized its analysis so that it could find more and more bugs. It wasn't anything particularly complex at the time, but yeah, it very quickly became useful to people other than me at Vimeo. So I was able to find bugs in my colleagues' code, and then they were able to find bugs before their code hit production, and they were happy about that.
Do you remember when you first introduced it at Vimeo, how people reacted to it? Where they basically, what I'm trying to get at is sometimes when you introduce a new tool, people are scared, like, oh, it does all those changes in the code, or I have to do those things. Were they hesitant, or did they?
Yes. So as with any large enough place, there are always going to be people who are, for good reason or for ill, that they are conservative about adding new things, and so there are a couple of those people at Vimeo, but I know at least some of them I was able to win over in the end by proving its worth. I think there are some people who are able to write code that is not without bugs, but it's generally has a very low bug kind of ratio, and those people are happy to not use a tool like SARM. Unfortunately, those people are very, very, very rare, and there are a lot of people who think they're those people but actually aren't. Many of the people who were skeptical, a month, 2 months, 6 months later, said actually, SARM's great. So yeah, that's gratifying.
Sounds cool. So do you remember how you introduced it as an open source project, how that came about? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so it was always my intent, not well always, but it was once I realized it was quite useful, I thought that other people might be able to benefit outside Vimeo. I had come across, I think I was about 9 months into creating SARM, and I realized through using Google or something that someone had created a similar package called Fan at Etsy. So the Rasmus Lerdoff, the creator of PHP, had created this package, and because I wasn't active in the PHP community at all, I had just not come across it. But then I realized two things. The first was that it only worked in PHP 7, and at the time we weren't using PHP 7. And the second thing was that, at least in my estimation, the analysis that SARM did was a bit more strict and, in my view, more correct than the analysis that Fan did. And so that kind of started this pattern of, I was dejected and I thought maybe we should just use this thing so I can stop work. But then I was like, actually, my thing's better. So I kind of plowed ahead and kept on.
Cool. And you said that at the time you were not using PHP 7 yet. So I assume you had PHP 5 running. And that means
Yeah, we had PHP 5.4 running for a long time.
Okay.
Way past its secure date. It's end of life. Don't tell anyone.
You're probably not the only ones, but yeah, we won't tell.
Yeah.
So that means you didn't have access to the abstract syntax tree, right, for the analysis?
Well,
which
but
PHP 7
because Nikita, well, there was an extension, the PHP AST extension, which was what Fan was using originally. Now Fan can use abstract syntax tree generated by another package, but at the time there was that requirement. Luckily, the same person who created that extension, Nikita Popov, also created a PHP package that could generate those same abstract syntax trees, but in plain PHP, and that's what SARM has used ever since.
And I assume that Psalm helped you move from PHP 5.4 to PHP 7 at Vimeo. Can you tell us a little bit on the process there, how you used it?
So honestly, it wasn't really using Psalm. There are all these debates as to how much backwards compatibility a new major version of PHP should break. But PHP 7, upgrading from PHP 5.4 to PHP 7, it was like 5.4 to 5.6 very briefly, to 7, 7.1. Was a very, very small upgrade. Like there were very, very minor bits of our site that broke. Everything that broke pretty much, I mean, basically everything was covered by a test already. So Psalm doesn't really help us with that upgrade. Because again, most of the things that broke, I'm just trying to recall this. It was now thankfully a long time ago, but the things that broke were just like changes in how changes in how the reset function worked, or like how a loop would reset the counter, for example. Like there were small things like that. So it wasn't something that a static analysis tool could easily detect.
Okay, so since we talked a lot about what you do with PHP, with Psalm, and where you could use it and where not, maybe let's go a step back and actually, can you tell us what Psalm actually does?
Okay, yes, right. So Psalm is a tool that will help you find bugs in PHP code. So it does a thing called type inference, which is it looks at things you assign to variables. So like, let's say I assign 5 to a variable, it will then know that that variable has the value 5, and it will use that information as it looks at how the variable is used. So it's a very common thing. It's easiest to compare it to things that other people might have used, like TypeScript, or like the type checker in Java. Basically, it's a type checker for PHP, but it also does some other fun things, because if you can do type checking, you can add on you can use that information gleaned from type checking to do some other fun things. So it has some like unused variable detection, for example. It has some unused unused method detection, and it has security analysis as well, fairly recently. So yeah, it's a bit of a kitchen sink tool now. So I originally designed it just to find bugs in my code, and I'm wary of adding too many extra things to it, which we might get to it later. But so in the main, if you haven't used it, and if you don't use a static analysis tool to check your code for bugs, you should absolutely use it, or try it and see if it helps you.
Yeah, cool. So I think one of the things that most people use Psalm for, at least most people I know, is the magical types. You already mentioned them, where you can basically have types that PHP doesn't support. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that? Maybe even how it works?
Sure. So when I'm creating this tool, I'm trying. So about 3 or 4 years ago, reasonably early on the creation of this tool, I had this idea that, like, what if we could make PHP like a statically typed language? What if we could force every variable to have a known type? It's sometimes the case that you might be calling a method on something and you don't know, and the static analysis tool can't figure out what you're calling the method on. For example, if you're calling a method on a variable that doesn't have a type in a param type, and so you have a function and it has a param $a, and you don't give it a type, and then you call $a and like get video, you don't know what the thing you're calling is. And so I thought, like, what if I could make Psalm complain every time you tried to do that, every time you tried to call something where you didn't know what it was. So I introduced this mode, this kind of it was called totally typed at the time. And so then what followed was I started to use these rules in Psalm's own source code. And so I was kind of like, okay, everything in Psalm itself, it has to know exactly what it's doing at all times. And then I ran into situations where there was no way to figure out what the type would be, because just using the existing documentation types, the existing like param types, it was impossible for Psalm to figure out what the type of a given thing was. So then I thought, well, okay, then I kind of worked backwards, and I thought, what new types do I need to create so that Psalm would be able to verify that this was what it was saying it was. And so things like the class string type, which is a type that represents something, a string that represents a class. And in PHP, you can use a class constant like foo : class. That in Psalm is typed essentially as a class string, and a class string has its own type. And what's more, you can it's a sort of generic type. You can say a class string of exception, and that will match any like exception it will mind. It will match unexpected value exception. It will match runtime exception, the name of the class in the string. So those sorts of generic types helped me get to like a total type coverage in the Psalm code base, and therefore like helped other people get to total type coverage in their own code bases.
Cool. You already mentioned that there's another tool out there, Fan, that is quite similar, but not as good as you said as your tool.
Well, yeah, I mean, so Fan, I feel that so there are a number of tools. There's Psalm, there's Fan, there's PHP Stan, there's Exacat. There is a type checker you get in PHP Storm that just kind of runs as you run PHP Storm. There are some type checkers built into language servers. So IntelliFence has one. So yeah, there are a number of. Psalm is not the only tool with a type checker now.
Yeah, but do you think that there's something that Psalm does that those tools don't do, or that it does better than, for example, PHP Stan or Fan?
I have to be careful because I like Andre, and Tyson is also a regular contributor.
That would be my next question. If you actually interact with each other and share information between each other.
Oh yeah, yes,
let's do the first one.
So it's a similar sort of situation to kind of politicians in rival parties that like by day they will say, you know, our tool is like, you know, our idea is better, but by night they might be kind of like having drinks together. So Psalm does a few things that those tools don't. I have a fun list on the website, so I'm going to reel off some of them. So many of these things aren't out of reach of what these other tools could do, but it's at the moment they've decided not to implement them. So a very good example is that kind of strict type, the idea that everything should have a known type, and that's something that I think Andre is planning to bring to PHP Stan at some point. What I think he's concerned about currently is that some people have their analysis set to kind of max, and there is this idea. So when you opt into this strict thing, which is to say I want everything to have a type, suddenly using Psalm on a large code base can become a bit boring because Psalm starts to complain all the time. And so I think he's worried that people will see this in PHP Stan and think, well, this tool is just stupid. How can it not understand what I'm doing? Which happens a bit with Psalm too. But so that's one of them. That penalizing the lack of type information. Another thing Psalm does is it has, and I'll probably write an art. Well, I have a half-written article about this. It has a kind of quite complex way it figures out how types can change given conditional statements around the types, and it's too complex to really explain the benefit just in talking to you. But suffice to say, it's reasonably clever and also reasonably concrete that it now doesn't introduce. It's a reasonably fully fleshed out system that doesn't have, as far as I know, any bugs, and it just allows you to write code, the sorts of PHP code that people often write in a kind of idiomatic style, and Psalm still understands that code that other tools, including TypeScript and pretty much every other type analysis tool, will trip up on. So that's something. I mean, that's kind of my own kind of fun hobby thing, but that's one thing. So property initialization checks is actually something that PHP Stand's added reasonably recently, and that's if you have a property, Psalm will ensure that it's properly initialized everywhere. And it has a few extra things. I mean, it can still do a few things that PHP Stan cannot when it comes to determining whether that property has been set properly. One big thing is security analysis. So being able to detect potential security flaws in your code. And that's something that is a bit harder for one of these other tools to add, just because it takes a while to have everything hooked together. Also a language server. Now Fan has a language server, and obviously PHP Storm, it's itself an IDE, so it doesn't need its own language server. A language server, if for those who are unfamiliar, it's basically the ability to provide IDE sort of functionality in any editor that you want. So if I'm using Vim or Emacs or VS Code, all of those could talk to the same language server, which is a daemon, a process that's spun up and that Psalm is just running at all times, responding to requests. And also fixes. So Psalm can automatically fix code. Many of its issues, like missing return types, it can fill in property types, it can fill in param types, it can do a whole bunch of fixes. And that's something that there does exist. There's a tool called Rector that can do many of those things, and Rector has just a whole suite of other things it can do. Psalms are generally more just responsive to the things it can detect, those kind of core things like missing return types, missing param types, invalid return types. And Psalm can also do a bit of refactoring. So let's say you have a class, these are things that are often provided in IDE, but that aren't available. And because I have the means to do it, I just did it.
You already mentioned a lot of tools and different people, and I wonder, you as a maintainer of Psalm, where do you get your ideas? Is it mainly the community? Is it other tools, or is it still your work at Vimeo?
It's all of that, all of the above. So for security analysis, for example, it was an idea. I mean, the security analysis exists in professional software, and I also read an article from Facebook. There was a paper they published about their own internal tool. There was a bit of professional kind of jealousy. There was like, if Facebook can do it, I can do it. Which the thing I created is much simpler than the thing Facebook created, to be clear. but it uses the same basic. It's a lot of the same principles. It's looking at the way that information flows through code, and importantly, it's found a whole bunch of vulnerabilities on Vimeo's code base. So like that came from a desire to build something that we could use at Vimeo. And yeah, and a lot of the time, the impetus for a particular thing comes from I'm at Vimeo, I see people struggling with a particular thing. Let's find a way that static analysis could help. And sometimes static analysis can't help. There are lots of things. Like there are things that you just need to write a test for. But sometimes static analysis can come to our rescue.
All right. You want to say something? Okay, typical online thing. So, as I already hinted at, I would like to know if you and Andre, for example, or Rasmus, share ideas when you work on the tools, or if you get stuck, for example, with something. Do you exchange ideas? Do you have like a personal connection on like Slack or something where you ping each other with issues or discuss things?
Generally not on the issue level, and to be clear, I have no communication with Rasmus. But Andre and I, like we Slack each other, we send messages occasionally, and generally it's not about the technical details. It's just about kind of interpersonal, like oh this I don't know. I don't want to betray any competences, but yeah, it's not generally related to the individual technical issues, but it's more related to the fact that we're maintainers of large static analysis tools, and we run into many of the same issues as we're like maintaining these tools.
Cool. Did you ever plan on doing a talk together, since basically you're doing similar tools?
Well, we've only. I don't think there is. Well, first of all, I think Andre is more than capable of giving a talk on his own, and I've been to one, and they're good, and we also, we live in different time zones. There is no reason necessarily to need to team up. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think it's maybe time to move on to talk about Psalm version 4. But before we do, maybe we can ask you a few quick questions to learn more about our today's guest. So just from the tip of your head.
So let me quickly share my screen again. Hopefully you can see the quiz now. And basically I will refresh this page, and then you will see this or that question, and just quickly answer which you would pick. So let's start with PSR 6 or PSR 16.
I honestly don't know either of those PSRs. The only PSR I've like PSR 2, PSR 1, PSR 4. I'm like vaguely aware of what those are. Anything beyond, I haven't been up to speed.
It's cache and simple cache, but yeah, let's just skip this then. Emacs, Nano, or VI?
So I just use VI, Vim. Yeah.
All right. Strict types on or off?
I've never used strict types in code that I've written. Really? Part of the reason, most of the reason is that Psalm can generally find the sorts of bugs that you might otherwise run into with strict types on. So there hasn't been a particular need, but I would rather that strict types have been on by default, but that's a whole other conversation.
That's strange. I would have picked like strict types because just as you said, typing. But yeah, that makes sense. If Psalm actually catches it for you, then yeah, sure. All right, next one. London or Detroit?
I've never actually been to Detroit, so I don't want to kind of come down. But actually, I believe Vimeo CEO is from near Detroit at least. So well, at least from the same state. So yeah, I don't want to come down. I grew up in London, so I guess I'm biased there. Like London's great. Let's go with that, London.
Okay. And GitLab or GitHub?
GitHub.
Okay.
I'm used to it. Uh,
Twitter or Reddit?
well, I don't know which is more or less responsible for the destruction of the world. Um, I, uh, I enjoy the communities on Reddit much more, but I'm also a Twitter addict, so I can't choose. I'm split.
Okay, then maybe the last one. Oh, we had this already. We had this already too. Tabs or spaces? That's a good closer.
Spaces.
All
Yeah,
right.
tags are annoying.
Okay, thanks. Then let me stop presenting, and then I hand over to Christopher for the next round of questions.
All right. So Psalm 4 came out last fall, and there are a couple of
Yep.
things, couple of major things changing, right? Because of there is a no diff flag now that enables the behavior of Psalm 3 with dealing with changes. But I guess to understand what the real changes, we need to dig into the maybe steps Psalm does while reading and analyzing the code, right?
Oh yeah, I mean there's a lot of things that hopefully people never have to worry about when Psalm looks at code. But yeah, Psalm when Psalm needs a file, it converts that regular kind of text file into an abstract syntax tree, and then does some extra work there. So Psalm the basic functionality that came in Psalm version 4 is that you can now, when you run Psalm by default, it will do these. It will only reanalyze code that you've changed and code that is affected by code that you've changed. So if you delete a method, it will reanalyze all of the classes that might have called that method and kind of flag that there was a mistake in those classes, like a newly introduced mistake. Um, but to do that, it has to, well, one, it has to have a map of all classes that call which methods and like classes that refer to other classes and all of that, and that's a bit complicated. But it also, for speed reasons, if you're changing, let's say you're changing a single line in a file that's 3,000 lines long, 10,000 lines long. I can neither confirm nor deny that Vimeo has files that big. Um, uh, if you're changing a single line in that code, you don't want Psalm to have to repass all of the lines in that file. Ideally, Psalm would only pass maybe the method that line is contained inside. So so what Psalm does is it kind of compares the two files. It has a cache of the file. It figures out how many lines have changed. Then it figures out what methods are contained in those changes, and it kind of generates these diffs, that have kind of extra metadata in, and then it passes those over to the parser and the analysis. So basically, Psalm is only reanalyzing the stuff it really needs to reanalyze. And so this is pretty useful for the new Psalm kind of diff by default version functionality, but it's also useful in a language server mode, because when you're running a language server and you're just kind of backspace in a line, you don't want whenever you're editing that file, you don't want someone to have to reanalyze that whole thing. You only want to analyze that single inside the method. So I originally developed this functionality for Psalm's language server functionality.
Okay.
So for that kind of ID like completion.
Yes, and I think speeding up the Psalm analysis in maybe to optimize the pipeline or stuff like that is very important if you have a tool like that. And I think there's another major change about unused variables. So
Yeah. So this relates to the security analysis in a strange way. So when you're doing security analysis, let's say you have a function that takes a get param, and then it returns the value of that get param, say without sanitizing it, and then you have somewhere else you have something that echoes the return type of that function, and it puts it on a web page, say. There you have a potential security vulnerability. Someone could insert a kind of a script tag in that get param, and suddenly that script tag appears wherever that echo happens. So Psalm has this security analysis mode that, or called taint analysis, where it can detect those sorts of things. But to do that, it needs to track that kind of tainted data, the get param, like figure out exactly where it comes in and how it can flow out. And what we're interested in is flows of data. So how data can flow through an application. So as I was doing this, and I was thinking to myself, this mirrors how we would deal with unused variable, how we would detect unused variables. So some already had unused variable detection, but it was this. I had the kind of the type analysis going here, and then alongside it, every time I would do some operation like an if else statement, and like handling that, I would have the stuff that like handle the types, the type juggling that happens inside an if statement, and then I'd have some extra stuff that handled whether or not the variables were used. And so I had these kind of two things that weren't really talking to one another. And I thought, what if I can combine the two? And this basically using the security analysis machinery allowed me to combine the two and model the unused variable detection as a flow problem rather than a kind of a separate, distinct thing. So yeah, in computer science, there are these kind of classes of analyses that are described as well. I only have like a degree in like a regular bachelor's in computer science. I'm not qualified to talk about the stuff, but basically this is a kind of known thing, and so I just used a lot of the same infrastructure that I had written for the security analysis, but instead just within a given function to see whether a variable was used or not. And it turns out to be very accurate and found things that the other thing couldn't. And the other wonderful thing is you can combine this with the automated fixes. So Psalm fixes things automatically, right? And it can remove unused variables automatically. And so once I improved the unused variable detection, it was able to, it meant that it could remove like much larger chains of unused data. So yeah, it's and it has, I think it has a couple of bugs that have been reported, but it's generally a kind of reasonably robust system because it's more theoretically sound.
To me, both features sound very complex in the implementation, and your Psalm is a tool that lives in a kind of meta space around the language itself. How much time did you invest in the release of Psalm 4 and the new features, or is it hard to measure?
It's a bit hard to measure. So the unused variable detection, I merged as a thing that only went into Psalm 4. I don't know, probably a few days. You know, took maybe 6 hours or so to get maybe more like a weekend's worth of work to get a proof of concept of unused variable detection working with this new framework. But then to kind of find more and more bugs and to polish it, and to, for example, I would just run it run Psalm on Vimeo's code base again and again and again and again until I kind of detect until it wasn't giving me bugs anymore, wasn't giving me false positives rather for the unused variable detection, and so that whole process takes a while. Okay. So I for the unused variable detection, probably like 4 or 5 days of kind of solid work, although that was scattered over a few weeks. And the other yeah, it's work. Also, thankfully, it's not just work by me. Certainly when it comes to bug fixing and some features too, there's a community of open source contributors who help with it.
And how is it for you? Does your employer give you the opportunity to work on Psalm in your working time? It sounds like Vimeo really profits or benefits from benefits from Psalm. So how is it? Is it the main part of your free time invested in your free time, spare time, or is it more a working thing?
So when I started working on Psalm, like for a few years, it was mainly my spare time. But I would work in it at work, and they saw. It's fair to say they saw value in it, but they maybe didn't see the same value that I saw in it. And also, frankly, it didn't have the same value that it has now. Now it depends on the week. Sometimes I'm spending quite a lot of the week working on it, but it's fair to say that Vimeo sees the value in it now, and it's Vimeo's largest open source project by a lot, and Vimeo has because our application, we have 1 million lines of PHP, and that's powering Vimeo.com, which is our main property. Vimeo, and there is a vested interest in making sure that PHP is a healthy, vibrant language.
That sounds great. So that you can that your employer always also sees the benefits. And the last question about the release. So PHP 8 is out for about 2 months now and brings new features like name parameters and attributes. So I saw that Psalm 4 also covers that. And how was your experience in adapting to and working towards compatibility to PHP 8?
It was reasonably easy. There were no. Sorry, I'm just going to look over my notes on when it comes to PHP 8. There were no kind of big hurdles really. It was. Yeah, I mean, there have been a few bugs reported, but most of them have been fixed. And yeah, so the null safe operator was probably the one of the more complex ones. The idea is that that you can have a question mark before the kind of property access or the method, and that just required some type juggling, some extra kind of stuff. Like it behaves a bit like a null coalesce operator, so like I had to employ some of the same ideas. Named arguments are reasonably straightforward. Match expressions are fun. So match expressions, which is I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but I think Ilya Tavillo, I think I can't are this great thing. It's a equivalent of a switch, but in an expression. And the idea is that you can so instead of having a switch statement which assigns in each branch of the switch statement, you instead have a kind of assignment up front. So you're assigned to the result of the match expression, and there are some fun rules that Psalm can use for match expressions that it cannot use in switch statements rather. So yeah, match expressions are fun because they allow Psalm to be a bit more strict than it normally gets to be. So that's been good. For expressions, Psalm supports. The exciting thing about throw expressions is the same basic mechanism will be useful for is expressions, which I think is an RFC that's either kind of in the grass stage or maybe is full. But is expressions will be a kind of the next big thing, presumably in 8.1. So we'll see about that. Union types were fairly straightforward because Psalm already supports union types. Every type in Psalm is modeled as a union type and has been kind of since day one. But now they're actually in the language, which is great. And if you're unaware of what a union type is, it's basically the return type of strpos. It returns the index in a string, or it returns false if it can't find that substring in the haystack, the needle in the haystack. And so the return type of strpos is string or false, and that's a union type. It's like two different things it can return. So Psalm supports that, and that's great. And attributes, which are probably actually the hardest thing in terms of just because there was quite a lot there to implement. It's and when Psalm 4 was initially released, it didn't have all of the kind of the moving parts, but now it does, or has pretty much all of them, and I'm very excited to see what people do with attributes because it's it will just make a lot of code a bit cleaner. We could there isn't so much scope at Vimeo, but there could be. I mean, it's kind of it's a sort of build it and they will come thing that there are things that we could now model as attributes maybe if we wanted to.
Yeah, I already saw there are a lot of blog posts of you. So one is about telling about a compromise in 2016, creating own doc block tags, and now you released a package, right, for the attributes as well.
Yeah, and for Psalm namespace attributes, there's also a package for PHP Storm has created their own attributes. I make clear in this article, I don't see attributes. I don't see there to be any benefit of moving most Psalm type annotations to attributes, because the strength of attributes in my mind are things that are read at runtime, because they're easy to reflect. Whereas in the past, you would have to parse, you would have to get the doc block. If you wanted to get something at runtime, you'd have to get the doc block and then pass that doc block. With attributes, all the data comes kind of pre-assembled, so you don't have to do any runtime parsing, and that should mean things are much quicker. You rely on the engine to do all the parsing, which is great, but I don't see those doc blocks having value for. I don't see attributes having value for things that are only read by static analysis tools. Because for a static analysis tool like Psalm, there is no difference between a doc block and an attribute. Like they're all just text in a file.
Yeah, you don't have a runtime, so that's the key issue, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, there are some basic questions, of course, about a major release. Is there anything your users or Psalm users have to know about the release in terms of breaking changes or maybe new rules they have to focus on?
No, not really. For the most part, Psalm releases are. I try and not to break too many things. There are a couple of API changes, and I'm also not the best at ensuring there are no breaking changes, but it's reasonably straightforward. It still works in PHP 7.1. And that's mainly because we have like one box in our system that still uses PHP 7.1, so we can't shift over yet. But luckily we're not as far behind as we were when we switched over from PHP 5.4, and it's being worked on as we speak. So yes, it should be. I mean, if everything should basically work the same. One of the Psalm contributors has recently revamped the plugin API, and so a forthcoming Psalm 5 will deprecate the old plugin Psalm API, but that won't probably come out until the end of the year at least. So yeah.
Mentioning Psalm 5, do you already have some big changes or new features you can speak about? No?
No. So generally, I try to add as many features just in minor versions as possible. I reserve major versions for breaking changes. So generally there aren't too many things. It just so happens that with the unused variable detection, it's sort of lined up, and the using diff by default, again, it lined up with a thing that suited kind of being in a major version. With the diff functionality, for example, most of that functionality already existed, but it was not on by default. So people had to opt in. And so like the major version was just kind of changing that to the default. And so those are the sorts of changes I generally like. Generally features are like exist, but maybe like the flag would be the Boolean flag would be changed in the major version bump.
Okay. Before we come to an end, I would invite everything watching to ask questions in the chat so we can forward them to Matt. So if you have any, drop them now. Question from my side, do you have an advice for starters when someone wants to start with Psalm in the code base in the company tomorrow? What would be the best to kick it off?
Just run Psalm. Runs like when you run it, you just run Psalm in it, and it will figure out a kind of a good default for your code base. If you're running it on a large code base, running Psalm on a large code base, then you should maybe use a baseline. So Psalm for the past couple of years has supported baseline functionality, and the idea is that you can create a baseline of existing issues, so you don't have to fix all of the issues straight away. But then anytime you're writing new code, it will flag that new code. And the straightforward idea behind that is that generally the code that is in production is not code that like maybe has bugs because it's been battle tested, right? So you have this, let's say code has been in production for 10 years. That code, it might have things that Psalm says is not ideal, but it probably doesn't have major bugs if it hasn't, like, servers haven't been crashing, if customers have still been getting whatever. So by using the baseline, you can grandfather in those issues, and you can say we don't care about those, at least for now, and that a lot of people have found it useful. We found that very useful at Vimeo because it's allowed us to increase the level of checking. So, for example, we used not to be able to penalize people who wrote new code that called methods on things that we didn't know what it was calling them on. So I spoke earlier about calling methods where we didn't know what the object was on the left-hand side. Now we penalize that at Vimeo. So every time you're writing new code and you're doing that, Psalm raises an error. But we allow all the existing times people have done that to be grandfathered in. And that turns out to be very, very useful for improving code quality over time.
So if I recall correctly, there is a type coverage output very at the end of the Psalm output. Do you consider that as a quality measurement as well, that you can say a code base with a type coverage of maybe 85 or a coverage of 95 is more stable? Or
I want to be careful there because a code base that has 100% type coverage, like Psalm has like 99%, 0.9%. A code base with that type coverage can still have bugs in, so it's no replacement for tests. It's no replacement for and even tests can themselves be buggy. So there is, but it's certainly a code quality metric that I think is important when you're working on a code base with with 10, 20, 30, 40 other people, you want as much of the code base to be documented as possible so you understand what you're doing. It helps you avoid bugs, and yeah, to your point, it helps some figure out whether or not something you're doing is risky. And that's the most important thing. It's the maintainability of a code base, in my view, goes up the more types some can infer, and that's what goes into that type coverage metric.
All right. Yeah, for me, just when I start a new side project or something like that, I install Psalm and I try to keep it at 90, 98, 99, something like that. So that's one of my my goals when I write new code. So I think
great.
That is quite cool if you want to kick off with a new project, that you enable Psalm from the beginning on, try to figure it out, that you have a decent level. I don't know, do you have a level? I think Psalm has 6 levels, right?
Yeah, and I think it has 8 levels. So, and confusingly for anyone who's used PHP Stan, they're opposite. So the strictest level is level 1.
Okay.
And that's because I always knew at the beginning what the strictest level would be. Like it was so in kind of numbering terms, like it made sense to make the strictest level being 1, but I didn't know how lenient some could be. So initially there were 5 levels, and I made some more and more lenient as time went on. Yeah, the most lenient, the easiest level is level 8, I think, and then you kind of work down from there. But if you run some init on an old code base, it will decide on a level for you. It will analyze the whole code base, and it will look to see like kind of how many, it will kind of look at the number of different sorts of errors you have, and it will find one where basically there is a low number of errors for that particular level.
Okay. All right, thanks for the insights. Dennis, I don't know, are there questions?
There are a few questions in the chat, so let's start with the first one that's actually not related to Psalm. It's about the match expressions. When you mentioned those, you said there's another expression that might come in 8.1. Can you explain which one that was? People were interested in that.
Those are is expressions. So in Hack, there's a language called Hack, which is an offshoot of PHP created by Facebook, and instead of like foo instance of bar, like $foo instance of bar, you would write foo is bar, and this has some benefits. One, it's shorter than instance of, right? So it's like foo is bar, but also it works with string. So if foo is string instead of the is string function, and this, like from a execution standpoint, this would just be faster for PHP, because generally when you're writing PHP, you can there's the isString method, and that maps to a type check in actual PHP code, but PHP can only inline that instruction if it knows that the isString function you're referring to is like fully qualified. So if you're in a namespace, you could be referring to one of a number of different isString functions, because you could have a isString function in the namespace that you're in. So, but if with the is expression, with is expressions like $foo is space string, the parser, the thing that turns that into instructions, can just very easily convert that. And so there is that benefit, but also just from a like ergonomic standpoint, it just looks slightly nicer in the code base.
Okay, thanks. Okay, then now to an actual Psalm question. Ronan asked if you use Psalm as a part of your CI in Vimeo, and if you do, can you maybe you don't?
Yes, yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely we do. That was the entire point, kind of from year 0. Yeah, we use Psalm in CI. We have since I created it. Like I think about a week after I created the thing that just ran on my machine, we introduced it to CI so it could work there too, and it runs on every like PR in every commit to master, and at Vimeo, and we run it. We run it with cache. Kind of all of the things that I recommend people do. We run it. People run it locally. Yeah, and we're starting to use it in CI as well for security analysis. But currently, it's only just run on my machine, but like in the next month or so, we'll hopefully get there where it's run in CI.
Right. I don't see any more questions in the chat.
That's
Maybe
fine.
if someone has one, they can repeat them. But if not, I will already say thanks. It was really interesting to talk to you.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was
thanks.
wonderful to talk to you and to get to show the view out my window and to yeah, just like thank you for your questions. Very good questions.
And I would like to thank you as well for the tool itself, because it's in my daily work part nowadays, and it's quite amazing to catch those silly things sometimes you left behind in your commit. So I'm pretty happy that we could make this today. Let's talk about the next episode quick. There is an episode about Xdebug 3.0, I guess next week already on Tuesday,
Thursday?
Thursday. Oh,
Thursday? Oh, okay.
Wait a second.
Sometime next week. We will not. We are really prepared. That is
It's
top-notch
February
work.
the 3rd, so it's Wednesday, right?
It's
All
Wednesday,
right.
yes.
So, thanks for joining in as well. I see there are a lot of comments in the chat, and thank yous as well. So, Matt, thanks, and everyone else. See you next week, and have a good night. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.